Now, with us to talk about their party's policies, we have Labour's Jim Murphy and in Murray, the SNP's Angus Robertson. Gentlemen, a very good morning to both of you. Angus Robertson, first of all, what you're proposing is not doable, according to our NATO expert. Being a NATO member but remaining free of nuclear weapons, as Mr Salmond proposed this week. Mr Miller was saying that the stance is illogical.
Well, he has a right to that point of view, but it doesn't square the facts. Both Norway and Denmark are currently member states of NATO and do not have nuclear weapons on their soil and have a policy that they don't want to have them on their soil. And we shouldn't also forget the precedents that we have both from Canada and Greece, who did see the departure of tactical nuclear weapons from their soil. Pierre Trudeau was lauded by doing so in the 1970s. So it's entirely consistent by wanting to work together with neighbours and allies. We would do so as a conventionally armed country, just as the overwhelming majority of other NATO member states. Of course you accept the rule book. Of course you have to work within the strategic concept, but NATO is pledged to work towards nuclear disarmament. Scotland can play its part in that by being a country of 5 million. No other country of 5 million has nuclear weapons. We don't need it. And that's one of the great advantages of voting yes in the referendum. We can actually get the defence and security policy that the overwhelming majority of people of Scotland would want.
Well, Franklin Miller did say that Norway and Denmark had a consistent position. You're essentially upsetting the apple cart with your position now. And he also said that when it comes down to it, you're just not playing your part in risk and burden sharing.
Forgive me, I just mentioned the fact that both Canada and Greece, which had tactical nuclear weapons stationed on them, had them removed. So that was a change to the status quo there. It was possible for them. It will be possible for us. I think what is important, though, is to recognise that Scotland is a very important geostrategic position in Northern Europe. We've got the North Sea to our east, the Atlantic to the west, and the Iceland Gap to the north. That means that we do require to have the appropriate conventional forces. Unfortunately, the UK is not providing that in Scotland at the present time. We have no maritime patrol aircraft. We have literally no conventional naval craft operating out of Faslane. That is what is required. That is what our neighbouring countries really want Scotland to do, to remain within NATO and work with them on a conventional basis. That's what the SNP is proposing. I think that's appropriate to work with our neighbours and friends within NATO in that context.
OK, Jim Murphy from Labour, it's kind of ironic that what the SNP is proposing here is pretty much what a lot of Labour people would quite like to see, a nuclear-free Scotland, but yet retaining the safety of the NATO umbrella.
The more we discuss this, the more we listen to Mr Miller in Washington, it's clear the SNP haven't done their homework. There doesn't seem to be much logic, indeed, in trying to get out of our nearest military alliance, which is the United Kingdom, and then not meet the rules of the largest military alliance, which is NATO. And in fact, actually, being outside of NATO for a prolonged period, the SNP's idea that there'll be some quick fix and an independent Scotland could just rejoin NATO without any difficulties is fanciful. But on the point about the rules, the facts are clear. You've got to sign up to the strategic concept, which is about a nuclear umbrella. Of course, you don't have to have nuclear weapons on your soil, but you have to accept in principle and in practice that collective security of the nuclear umbrella, which the SNP play around with words on that, but they don't actually sign up to it. And the second is on money. You've got to pay the bills. And the SNP's budget, even the very creative budget that they've come up with, which no one actually accepts, doesn't meet NATO standards of threshold. So they're going to knock, if they were independent, they'd be knocking in a closed door, saying, let us join this NATO club, but we won't sign up to the rules and arrangements inside NATO. Doesn't make sense.
Angus Robertson, you're not signing up to the rules, according to Mr Murphy.
Well, I'm delighted, because I'm sure everybody heard, and we can read the transcript there, that Jim Murphy has accepted that NATO member states do not have to host nuclear weapons.
Angus,
and that's exactly Scotland's situation.
I'm surprised that's news
what the
to you.
SNP is proposing...
Angus,
if you can just let me finish.
Almost everybody watching the programme knows this already.
Finish that point. Mr Robertson, finish that point.
If you can, thank you. And if one looks at the SNP's proposed budget for defence and security at 1.7% of GDP, that is in fact the European NATO average. So we've looked closely at what our neighbours, our allies and friends do, and we've worked out that we need to focus our efforts, particularly on maritime conventional defence. Our geostrategic position suggests that that's absolutely the right thing to do. No country of 5 million has nuclear weapons. 80% of people in Scotland don't want them. So Jim Murphy can choose to disregard the views of the people of Scotland and align himself with your Republican analysts that you just had on. That's fine. I'm on the side of the majority of people of Scotland who want to get rid of Trident. We want to work with our neighbours and friends. That's the appropriate way to go forward.
OK, Jim Murphy, there's a slight delay in the line. So.
Yep. Angus, you don't have to read my transcript. Almost anybody watching this programme knows that countries that are in NATO don't all have nuclear weapons, so don't pretend that that's news to you or to anyone else. But you enjoy comparing, of course, you enjoy comparing Scotland with Norway. In your fanciful budget of over £2.5 billion, Norway's spending about £4.2 billion equivalent on its defence. So let's compare like with like. And the fact is, it makes no sense to leave the UK military, to come out the British Army, the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force. So most Scots know that it just makes sense that in these islands we share that responsibility. And the problem is, the SNP know their argument doesn't add up in terms of leaving the UK military, and what they're desperately doing is trying to find another alliance. But the other alliance that's available to them, they don't fulfil the rules and criteria. It's another example of how they haven't done their homework, and it's an enormous risk for Scotland.
OK, well, Mr Robertson, when, according to Mr Murphy, you're not fulfilling these rules and criteria, why can't you just be like Ireland and not be a NATO member, not join NATO?
Well, for the reasons I've outlined twice already in this interview, we find ourselves in a very specific geostrategic position, and that means we do need to live up to our responsibilities to our neighbours, our allies, our regions, and we do need to ensure stability in providing for the appropriate conventional defence. What we've been looking at most closely is the Danish model, and at 1.7% of budget spend, we would be able to provide a very comparative offering to that by that NATO ally. Now, if these countries weren't living up to their responsibilities, then no doubt Jim Murphy or Lord Robertson would be calling for their expulsion. They're not. They're accepting what these countries do. They do a very good job working together with neighbours and allies, and that's what Scotland will do. It's just a shame that Jim Murphy chooses to disregard the views of the majority of people of Scotland who don't want nuclear weapons in our country. Right,
but actually, how do you define nuclear free? Because as we're hearing from Franklin there, I mean, if you've got military, if you've got subs sailing up the Clyde, you don't know what's going to be on board. If it's an American sub, they won't tell you what's on board. So you could have a nuclear missile coming into Scottish waters, and yet you have this anti-nuclear policy.
Well, I'm sorry, there's no great mystery about this. This is exactly the same policy as the government of the Kingdom of Norway has within NATO at the present time. It's an entirely workable policy. We shouldn't confuse two things. There's a rite of passage under the Convention on the Law of the Sea under the United Nations, and there's a big difference between that and having an agreement with your allies that you ask that they don't bring nuclear armed vessels into port. That's the way it works with Norway. I don't see why it can't work with Scotland.
OK, Jim Murphy, Dr Colin Fleming of the Politics and IR Department at Edinburgh Uni, writing in the Sunday Herald today, said Scotland being nuclear free is unlikely to be a serious impediment to NATO membership.
Well, we can have that conversation about Scotland being nuclear free as part of the general conversation about unilateralism versus multilateralism. We all want to see a world free of nuclear weapons, but it's a debate about how you do that. And world events show that there's nuclear capability, that decision is going to be taken over the next few years, and it's a decision that will affect our defence for decades to come. And I think you can give up all your nuclear weapons unilaterally, by yourself, if you can, with certainty, predict what the next 50 years is going to provide in terms of world events. No one in this conversation can say with certainty what the world's going to look like over the next 50 years. And I think it'd be irresponsible in that sense to be unilateralist. Let's negotiate together. The UK, the Chinese, the Russians, the French, the US, all of those countries together. Let's negotiate and get rid of our weapons in that way. But in a world where North Korea, Iran, and all of these other nations are considering trying to get nuclear weapons, a possible nuclear weapons arms race in the Middle East, it makes no sense for the UK to unilaterally give up its nuclear capability. It's a bit of a mystery.
It's a bit of a mystery as to what Labour actually want, because Ed Miliband and Ed Balls voted for Trident replacement, but the New Statesman called the silence from Joanne Lamont on Trident replacement deafening. So what does Joanne Lamont want?
Well, the Labour Party and Joanne Lamont, Ed Miliband, Ed Balls, all of us, we're not a unilateralist party. We don't believe in unilaterally giving up our nuclear capability.
Well, perhaps Joanne Lamont does, because we don't really hear much from her on this issue. And that's pretty clear.
Like, the defence is reserved to the House of Commons, and many important issues
well, she must have a view on
Scottish Parliament. Invite Joanne onto the telly and you can talk about the Labour Party's view. All of us together, we believe in multilateral nuclear disarmament, and in a world which is increasingly dangerous, remarkably volatile, where all of these countries are trying to acquire nuclear capability, The idea that the UK would give up its capability by itself when all of these things are happening doesn't make much sense. But the whole conversation, when you ask Angus, when you ask the First Minister, the more questions you ask, the fewer answers we get. Why would you give up membership of the fourth largest military in the world in terms of defence spending? Why would you give up, despite the cuts, the most capable European nation when it comes to defence? Why would you throw that all away on an offer and a risk and a one-way bet that they haven't got any answers on why you would leave the British Army, the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force behind? It doesn't make sense. And
Okay, Jim Murphy, I want to put that point to Angus Robertson. Angus Robertson making that point about Joanne Lamont there, but Mr Murphy saying that the Labour Party are not in favour of unilateral disarmament.
Well, that come as a lot of news and disappointment to a lot of people in the Labour Party who wish that it was. Last time the membership of the Labour Party in Scotland were asked the subject at a conference, they endorsed their position that they would prefer to get rid of nuclear weapons. We don't need them in Scotland. Let's use the money appropriately for conventional defence. We're in a very fortunate position that we can spend more on conventional defence with independence, less than we do within the UK, and get rid of nuclear weapons. It seems a pretty good deal to me.
Okay, and just on the point of risk and burden sharing, Mr Salmon was saying that he was keen to see American bases here, but of course John Wilson, the SNP MSP, has spoken out against moves to have American bases. They could launch an attack in Syria, or they could be used to host nuclear weapons.
Well, John's just been consistent with the position that he took at conference last year, which was in opposition to the defence update that I proposed. And in that policy that was passed by the SNP conference, it said that we were in favour of base sharing, logistics, training, etc. So, of course, it's up to a sovereign Scottish Government to make the appropriate base sharing arrangements if that is ever proposed. But the SNP is in favour of it. Our conference has passed that policy.
Okay, and Jim Murphy, finally, we're speaking about Labour's position on Trident. Des Brown, a very prominent member of your party, Lord Brown, a former Defence Secretary, he's been very sceptical about Trident replacement too, hasn't he?
Des is looking to see whether we can retain a military capability and a nuclear capability at a lower cost, and it's sensible to look at that. So the work that Des is doing is important. But responding to Angus's point, you know, in a complicated world of many powerful nations and dangerous countries, it takes more than passing the resolution at SNP conference to create a reality. The fact is you can't just walk into NATO once you become an independent state.
Right.
When it came to Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, it took 5 years, and they're not being honest with Scotland.
Thank you very much. Angus Robertson, thank you very much to you as well. I'm afraid we've run out of time.